Technology marches ever forward, and gaming is quite often on the crest of the wave when it comes to the latest exciting technological twist and turn. As with lists of these types, it's worth saying that we should handle nostalgia carefully. There's a lot to love about gaming today, after all. Still, all the same, it's fun to look back on history and see how things have evolved. In this particular instance, it's funny to see what was such a normal part of the gaming sphere that has faded into obscurity. I'm Cy for WhatCulture.com, and these are 8 video game revolutions we don't need anymore. Number 8. Multi-taps. Video games have always been a communal thing from the most humble days of the hobby until the present day. The earliest home consoles largely didn't think twice to include the ability to play with a friend, sibling, or potential mortal enemy, but largely multiplayer meant 2-player maximum. As the PlayStation hit stores in 1995 and exploded, its contemporaries saw a chance to boast that their games were more multiplayer friendly. The Nintendo 64 and Sega Dreamcast both came equipped with 4 controller ports. It seemed like this was the one thing that PlayStation didn't have until it did. The company introduced an optional boomerang-shaped peripheral that allowed gamers to play in groups of 4, or if you were lucky enough to have 2 multi-taps and a compatible game, even 8 players. In retrospect, Sony releasing the original PlayStation with only 2 controller ports seems incredibly ill-sighted, but it must have worked. They had the confidence to repeat the process when the PlayStation 2 launched in exactly the same state, necessitating another multi-tap release for the new generation. Of course, controller ports themselves tend to be a thing of the past now, as systems ship with wireless pads, and so there's no real need for a restriction at all. The Xbox Series X, if you so desire, can support 8 controllers. Sony's PlayStation 5, by some ironic and stubborn measure, can handle half of this. Well, it's better than 2 at least. Also, special shout out to the things that came before the multi-tap. Anyone remember the J-Cart for the Mega Drive? I remember the J-Cart. Weird. Number 7. Link cables. There's a similar story to tell with handheld gaming. The link cable is a stable part of Nintendo's handheld systems, releasing for the original Game Boy, the Pocket, the Micro, the Advance, and so on. Due to their different hardware, there were even plans for the doomed Virtual Boy to get one. And why not? It was the only way for these kinds of consoles to connect. The humble link cable allowed players to play the likes of Tetris together, but really exploded when Game Freak came a-knockin' with their new franchise that changed gaming forever. When most people visualise the link cable, they almost certainly see it with pocket monsters moving from one end to the other. Pokemon Red and Blue were built around the accessory, with catching them all necessitating a link cable and a friend with the opposite game. Later into the Game Boy Advance's life, Nintendo did experiment with wireless tech in its infancy, but it was finicky even if it did open the possibilities up to a possible 16 players. However, this was vastly improved by the time of the Nintendo DS. Around this time, of course, Wi-Fi became the standard source for connection, so the console dabbled in both. As with many things, the advent of the internet made the link cable irrelevant. Number 6. Console add-ons. During a time where video games were very quickly changing and the cutting edge of technology was always moving, the companies at the top had to be shrewd. Rather than release a whole new system, there were accessories and add-ons for existing consoles to make them more appealing. Sega were particularly known for the practice, turning the Mega Drive into a potential Frankenstein's monster of a machine for the most loyal consumers on their side of the console war. The 32X slotted into the top to run 32-bit games, and the Sega CD sat underneath to facilitate disc-based software. They weren't alone in trying this kind of thing either, as Nintendo did get in on the action. The 64DD foresaw the future of games on optical hardware rather than cartridges, although the company did discontinue it rather quickly. However, for their next system, they did include a rare and sought-after peripheral. The Game Boy player slotted under the GameCube, and whilst it didn't give players access to brand new games, it did let them play handheld titles on the big screen, like the Super Nintendo had done before it. Overall, the console add-on is a long-gone thought, in part to more standardized tech and rigid release cycles. Instead, it's far more common for systems to be updated with higher power siblings that, rather than come as an additional purchase, ask consumers to pay full price for a new system. In that light, maybe the Sega CD wasn't so bad after all. Number 5. The wireless network adapter. The Sega Dreamcast was a cursed crusader of gaming evolution that died so that the industry could learn from it. Unfortunately, being a forebear of console internet connectivity, it wasn't exactly easy to get online. Still, in Europe, the number of users that did connect to play the likes of Phantasy Star in the opening weekend was great enough to overwhelm BT's Dreamcast servers, a fact forgotten by the console's overall failure. And whilst the original Xbox introduced the world to the likes of Xbox Live, it was the Xbox 360 that people really think of when they think of the early days of online gaming. Yes, this console could wire into routers, but it was also the first home system that didn't necessarily need to. Video game peripherals often come with the stink of gimmick. Plastic instruments and dance mats are fondly remembered, but were identifiably limited life products. The wireless network adapter stands tall as the must must-have add-on of the era, and the back of most Xbox 360s were adorned with these small plastic boxes. Xbox Live had very quickly become generation-defining, and the silver model was available to all. And so the adapter was a great way to get the most out of your console, buying content off the store, watching Netflix, and of course playing Halo 3 with buddies. Now, such a thing is totally irrelevant. The internet and online gaming is everywhere we go, and as such, every device is just expected to be able to connect right out of the box. Number 4. Strategy guides and helplines. Time was, if a video game stumped you, you had little choice but to do one of 3 things: bear down and push through, abandon your one game a year purchase, or turn to someone else for help. But where does a player do this in the pre-internet age? Releasing a strategy guide alongside a game was fairly standard practice for a long time, especially with bigger and more complex games like RPGs. With officially licensed information, you now had access to the tips, tricks and secrets, as well as, in some cases, a beautifully curated piece of memorabilia. Owning a strategy guide just made you feel like some kind of sage. You held the sacred text, you knew the location of every item and the weakness of every boss. For those games that didn't have a guide but still presented a challenge, there were video game helplines. Nestled in games magazines amongst all the other advertisements, and even sometimes in the manuals of certain games themselves, these phone numbers were sold as a lifeline. Answers to your burning questions, and in the reverse, a lifeline to burning a hole in your parents' wallet, most likely. Of course, when gamers all over the globe were able to connect to each other via the World Wide Web, they were able to share this information that had been once only stored in guides and helplines. Websites filled with cheat codes and eventually full-on walkthroughs were some of the earliest video game pages on the internet, a death knell for the way things were. Number 3. Memory cards. It may not have been the first, but The Legend of Zelda in 1985 saving a player's progress was revolutionary. Forget all the new mechanics of the latest games, people overlooked that the grandiosity of a game that was so big you were able to turn it off and pick it back up later was such a major draw for the original Zelda. During the 80s and 90s, games with inbuilt save systems in their cartridge became more and more popular. It simply meant that games could become longer and more complex. For players, this meant more bang for your buck. For consumers, it was a big selling point. But when cartridges were out and discs were in, hardware developers had to rethink the whole thing. Thus came the memory card, a small plastic pseudo-sibling to today's USB sticks that were designed to hold the saves of a particular console. Whilst you could already take your save to a friend's if you had your cartridge, the memory card made for more options. You could copy that save, share it with others, and the device itself became a sort of fashion statement as PlayStation released coloured variants. Remember when see-through plastic was cool? The memory card survived until the Xbox 360 era, when USB became the standard format for data storage, and then, foregoing the need for additional accessories at all, the cloud. Number 2. Game over. In its simplest form, the notion of the game over after you've failed enough times is essentially a mark of capitalism. Seriously, it exists because arcade game manufacturers needed a way for players to keep putting money into a machine. In terms of the home console, platforming games are possibly the genre most associated with the concept of the one-up, where additional lives are the most prized commodity and playing your hardest means avoiding the game over screen at all costs. As such, these are the type of games to look at to measure the trend of the game over. The most recent examples paint a picture that the era of the game over is, well, over. 2017 Super Mario Odyssey made news when Nintendo revealed it didn't have a game over screen. It punishes players upon death by taking away 10 measly coins. This makes it harder to buy more of Mario's many outfits, but considering the game is abundant with them, really it makes no real difference. It's similar with the more recent Sonic Origins, which docks players of coins that are traded for museum content like concept art and music. That's not to say that dying in video games is going away, not by any stretch of the imagination. But autosaves between stages in video games mean that it's just a waste of time to be sent back to the title screen simply to reload the same checkpoint. When Mario and Sonic, two characters so heavily associated with lives, continues and the game over screen, are no longer using it, suffice to say that the game over is ironically dead. And number 1, E3. At the time of writing, we are days out from the announcement that E3 2023 has been cancelled. Even before the pandemic, the Electronic Entertainment Expo had lost quite a lot of luster, and in the last few years, with publishers pulling their presence, it only seemed like a matter of time. There's a sentimentality to E3 that is hard to decouple from the current situation. That letter and number are synonymous with a kind of community in gaming, whether in person or online, as fans worldwide came together every year to revel in the good reveals, reveals, the bad reveals, and the awkward presenters. E3 is home to some of the most legendary shared moments in gaming history, but with it becoming steadily more expensive for publishers to set up shop there every year, and streaming negating that, it was only a matter of time until enough of them pulled out to cripple the brand. At first, Nintendo hosting directs rather than stepping on stage seemed unthinkable. Now, as Xbox and Sony follow suit, it's really obvious. The Video Game Awards has essentially all but replaced E3. Gone is the show floor, but developers still get the space to drop their big reveals. More than this too, parts of E3 always had an undercurrent of corporate marketing, where the Video Game Awards, whether you agree with its choice of winners or not, is all framed around the positivity of celebrating gaming. Gamers can all absolutely mourn the apparent death of E3, but it's hard to argue that it's something that we really need anymore. And that's the list. Let us know what you thought of this video down in the comments below, and any memories you have of these once video game revolutions that just don't really exist anymore. And of course, any others that we could have included in this list. Make sure you like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Head over to WhatCulture.com for more content every day. I've been Si for WhatCulture, and have a good week.